In the 1970s, Singapore locked its longest river in a concrete drain to stop it flooding the city. Decades later, engineers tore the concrete out. The new channel now carries 40% more stormwater. That number sounds like a mistake. It isn't. The place is Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park in the middle of Singapore, and the waterway is the Kolong River, the island's longest, running about 10 kilometres from a forest reservoir down to the sea. For decades, the stretch running through this park was a straight, fenced-off concrete channel, flat, grey, empty of fish, cutting one half of the neighbourhood off from the other. Planners built it that way on purpose in the rush to urbanise after independence, when the fastest way to move a monsoon downpour out of a city was a smooth concrete chute. It worked in the narrow sense that water left quickly. It also meant a river with almost no life in it, walled off from the hundreds of thousands of residents living beside it. By the mid-2000s, that same channel had become a liability. Ang Mo Kio and Bishan had grown denser. More rooftop and pavement meant more runoff reaching the drain faster, and the old channel was nearing its limit. The obvious engineering answer was the one Singapore had used for 40 years. Pour a bigger, deeper concrete drain. Singapore's National Water Agency, PUB, chose the opposite. Working with the Parks Agency, NParks, and a design team led by the landscape firm then known as Atelier Dreiseitl, PUB decided to rip out the concrete and rebuild the channel as an actual river, wider, shallower, curved instead of straight, with soil and plants instead of poured walls. And they decided to let it flood, not by accident. By design. Here's the question worth sitting with. How do you remove a flood barrier and end up with less flooding, not more? The answer PUB landed on is a floodplain channel, and its logic runs opposite to a storm drain. A concrete drain is built narrow and fast, so water never lingers. A floodplain channel is built wide and slow, so a storm has somewhere to go, besides someone's living room. Under this design, the park itself became part of the drainage system. On a dry day, the Kallang River is a modest stream a few metres across, winding through grass and rock. During a heavy storm, the water is allowed to rise and spread sideways across the lawns bordering the river, turning parkland into a temporary lake for a few hours before draining away. The channel was widened, in places to 5 times its old width, and lengthened from 2.7 kilometres of straight concrete to roughly 3 kilometres of meander, because a longer, wider, winding path holds and moves more water than a short straight one, even though it looks gentler. Building it wasn't simple. Concrete banks are boring engineering, but they're predictable. They don't erode, they don't shift, they don't care about rainfall. Soil planted with vegetation does all three, especially in the tropics, where nobody had tried this at this scale before. So before construction began, the design team spent 11 months running a test reach, a real stretch of bank where they tried something like 10 different stabilisation methods side by side. Bundles of live branches staked into the slope, rock fill planted with cuttings, soil wrapped in biodegradable fabric, coconut fibre rolls pre-grown with reeds, wire cages filled with rock and planted on top. They measured how deep and how firmly roots gripped the bank under real rainfall before choosing which combination to use along the full 3 kilometres. It's the kind of preparatory work that's easy to leave out of the story, but it's the reason the banks didn't simply wash away in the first big storm. Tropical soil bioengineering at this scale had almost no local track record to build from. One more piece of the mechanism mattered before construction even started, getting a water utility and a parks agency to design one system instead of 2. PUB's job was moving stormwater safely, and Parks' job was running a public park. Historically, those were separate briefs handled by separate teams, which is part of why the old solution was a fenced concrete drain nobody thought about as parkland at all. This project forced a single design team to treat hydrology and landscape as one problem, which is also why the river carries wetland cells along its length, shallow planted pools that filter road and rooftop runoff before it reaches the main channel, cleaning the water at the same time the channel is carrying it. The construction crews also reused what they tore out rather than trucking it away wholesale. Broken concrete from the old canal was repurposed into embankments and park structures elsewhere in the site, and trees judged too damaged to keep were milled into furnishings instead of chipped. None of that shows up in the headline flood capacity number, but it's part of why the project reads as a genuine redesign rather than cosmetic landscaping over a drain that still does all the same engineering underneath. Construction ran from October 2009 to February 2012, a 2.5-year rebuild of a park that hundreds of thousands of people lived around at a public cost of roughly 76 million Singapore dollars, around 60 million US dollars at the time. The park reopened in March 2012, 3 kilometres of meandering river inside 62 hectares of parkland, up from 52 hectares before the redesign folded in more green space around the new banks. PIB and its project partners reported an early striking sign that the ecological side was working too. Roughly a 30% rise in species observed in the park during construction itself, insects especially, as damselflies and dragonflies moved into the new vegetated banks as soon as there was vegetation to move into. That figure comes from the project team rather than an independent survey, so it's worth holding a little more loosely than the numbers that follow. But the direction, more life showing up as the concrete disappeared, is consistent with everything observed afterward. Then came the first real problem, and it wasn't a design flaw so much as a predictable cost of the design succeeding. A slow, vegetated, standing water edge is exactly the habitat mosquitoes prefer, and Singapore takes mosquitoes seriously. Dengue fever is endemic here, and mosquito control is treated as public health, not nuisance. In the first 6 months after the water went in, mosquito numbers in the park rose noticeably. The design team's answer was not to spray. Spraying would have killed the very dragonflies, fish, and birds the project was trying to attract, undoing the point of the work to fix a side effect of it. Instead, they waited for the rest of the food chain to catch up. Dragonfly larvae, which eat mosquito larvae by the hundreds, then fish, then birds that eat both. It took roughly a season for that chain to establish. Mosquito counts came back down to typical Singapore park levels, not zero, but nothing exceptional once the predators arrived. Safety was the other early worry. PUB ran public workshops before construction because letting a river rise into a park sounds dangerous if you're a parent whose kids play there. The finished design answered that with gentle, gradually sloping banks instead of the old channel's sheer drop, plus warning systems for when the floodplain activates. Residents who'd been separated for decades by a fenced concrete drain started crossing to both sides. A volunteer group calling itself Friends of Kaling River formed to patrol the banks and look out for people and wildlife alike. Annual visits to the park now top 3 million, in a place that used to be defined by a barrier most people walked past rather than through. Did the flood engineering actually hold once real storms arrived? Singapore has had several since 2012, severe enough to test it. And photos of the park underwater have gone viral more than once, usually captioned as if something had gone wrong. It hadn't. Pub and local reporters have had to repeatedly explain that a flooded floodplain at Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park is the system performing exactly as designed, water spreading across lawns for a few hours so it doesn't spread across Bishan Road instead. The metric that matters isn't whether the park gets wet. It's whether the surrounding streets and homes stay dry during storms that would have overwhelmed the old concrete drain. By that measure, the project has been doing its job for more than a decade. Here's where the story gets more complicated and where a lot of retellings stop short. The easy version says the river came back to life. A peer-reviewed study published in 2021 by researchers who actually surveyed the fish gave a messier answer. They sampled the water inside the park between 2016 and 2018 and compared it to a downstream stretch of the Kalang that had never been naturalised. If the project had restored the river towards something like its original ecology, you'd expect native fish to move back in. That's not what they found. The fish community inside the naturalised park turned out to be dominated by 2 non-native species. A Central American cichlid called the Quetzal cichlid, making up more than 2/3 of everything sampled, and tilapia, both almost certainly descended from aquarium releases decades earlier. In the researchers' own framing, it was a new, unprecedented mix of species, not a returned one. And that pattern wasn't unique to the naturalised section. The same non-native dominated mix turned up downstream in the concrete canal nobody had touched. That finding doesn't undo the project. It resizes it. Turning concrete into curves and plants changed the river's shape, its bank habitat, its capacity to hold stormwater, and the insects and birds using its edges. All of that is documented. What it didn't do, at least for fish, was reset the clock to some earlier native baseline, because urban Singapore's waterways had already been reshaped by decades of non-native introductions long before this project began, and rebuilding the banks doesn't undo that. The researchers were candid about a second limit too. Nobody had run a proper biological survey of this stretch before the rehabilitation started, so there's no clean before and after comparison for fish at all. Only a comparison against a different, unrehabilitated stretch nearby, a reasonable stand-in, but not the same thing. The animal that made this project famous, though, isn't a fish. It's an otter. Smooth-coated otters had effectively vanished from Singapore by the 1970s, casualties of the same pollution and channelization that produced concrete drains like the old Canal in the first place. There was no confirmed sighting again until 1998. In 2014, 2 years after Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park reopened, a family of 5 smooth-coated otters turned up in the newly naturalized river. They stayed, bred, grew to a family of 10 that people started calling the Bishan 10, and eventually moved downstream toward Marina Bay, where their descendants are still a fixture. Filmed for a BBC documentary, put on a Google search doodle, chased by tourists with cameras. It's tempting to credit the park entirely for that. The honest version is more layered. Singapore's otters didn't come back because one park got new riverbanks. They came back because water quality across the whole catchment had been improving since a nationwide river cleanup campaign that began in 1977, more than 3 decades before this project, gradually making the island's canals and reservoirs capable of supporting fish stocks large enough to feed a top predator again. What the naturalised river at Bishan added was a specific, connected, vegetated stretch of habitat and shelter, arriving right when the wider system could finally support otters moving through it. Call it the last piece of infrastructure, not the whole cause. The timing lines up closely enough that most people who study this treat the park as a meaningful contributor rather than a coincidence, but treating it as the sole explanation overstates one park's role in a 40-year island-wide recovery. There's a coda worth including because it shows what this project actually changed at the policy level, arguably the biggest consequence of all. The stretch of river inside the park was never the whole Kallang, just 3 kilometres of a 10-kilometre river. Starting in 2015, PUB went back to naturalise a further downstream stretch between Bishan Road and Brattle Road at a separate cost of about $86 million, finishing in 2019 and adding roughly 80% more carrying capacity to that section. That's a different project, with its own budget and its own timeline, and it only happened because the first one had worked well enough, publicly and technically, to get repeated. The wider program behind both, called Active, Beautiful, Clean Waters, has since been applied at more than 100 sites around Singapore. The 2012 park picked up design awards in the years right after it opened, which looks good on a portfolio but is beside the point. The number that matters more is that a government kept spending money on the same idea for a decade after the first bet paid off. So, back to the actual question, did tearing out a flood wall and letting a park flood on purpose work? On the engineering claim, yes, cleanly. The channel carries roughly 40% more water than the concrete drain it replaced. The surrounding roads have stayed dry through storms that used to threaten them, and that's a measured result of the redesign itself. On the ecological claim, the honest answer is partly and unevenly. Insects and birds responded fast and visibly. Otters returned, riding the tail end of a much longer island-wide cleanup that this project fed into rather than started. Fish did not return to anything like a native baseline. They formed something new, still dominated by species that don't belong there. None of that makes the river a failure. It makes it a demonstration that a single infrastructure fix, however well engineered, doesn't automatically undo decades of ecological history all at once. Some parts of a system heal on the timeline of a construction project. Other parts, like a fish community, are still carrying the marks of choices made generations earlier. If you want more stories like this one, decisions that changed a river, a coastline, or a piece of land, and the evidence for what actually happened afterward, subscribe for more.